Hello everyone, Jolene here from Bookworm Adventure Girl. Welcome back and welcome to the 36th episode of Mondays with Margaret. Before we get started, I do want to acknowledge that I know this is going out on Tuesday and not on a Monday, but it wasn't because I didn't try. I filmed yesterday and was ready to post everything, but the tech gods were not cooperating, and this morning I had some more tech issues. So I am going to try again, and I'm keeping my fingers crossed that this works out. So this series has taken a bit of a hiatus, but I think that if the tech allows, we are now set to keep moving along and maybe get caught up a bit. For those of you who have been following along, and especially if you are reading the books with me, thank you so much for your patience, and be sure to check out the revised schedule. I have updated that and it is in the description box, and you can see that what we will be reading coming in the remaining weeks. So this week we are talking about the non-fiction book Moving Targets, Writing with Intent, 1982 to 2004. Moving Targets was originally published in 2004, and this edition has an introduction by Jeet here, who makes the same observation about moving targets that I've kind of been making all along with Atwood's earlier nonfiction, beginning with Survival, and then Second Words with Strange Things, and even in On Writers and Writing, and then definitely in this book as well. And that is that even though Margaret Atwood is writing about other authors and their writing, because she's reviewing their work, it gives us a good sense of the authors and the writing that has had an impact on her life and her writing as well. So Moving Targets is divided into 3 sections, basically according to decade. The first section picks up where Second Words ended, ranging from 1982 to 1989. The second section covering the 90s from 1990 to 2000, and then the final section covering 2001 to 2004 when the book was published. Margaret Atwood's introduction is as expected. It's direct, witty, and it prepares you for what's ahead. And at the beginning of each section, Atwood gives a description of what was going on at the time in the world, and also what was going on in her personal life. So from 1982 to 1989, she mentions the Soviet Union being in place and the Berlin Wall coming down in 1989. And I will read what Atwood herself says about her own personal and writing life. And this begins on page 9. I began the period quietly enough. I was trying unsuccessfully and for the second time to write the book that was, much later, to become Cat's Eye. And I was ruminating about The Handmaid's Tale, although I was avoiding this second book as much as possible. It seemed too hopeless a task, and too deeply weird a concept. Our family was living in Toronto's Chinatown in a row house that had been modernized by the removal of many of its inner doors. I couldn't write there because it was too noisy, so I would bicycle westward to the Portuguese district, where I wrote on the 3rd floor of another row house. I'd just finished editing the new Oxford Book of Canadian Verse in English, which had been spread out all over the same 3rd floor. That had been a retrospective activity, and so was the first piece in Moving Targets. In the autumn of 1983, I went with my immediate family to England, where we rented a Norfolk manse said to be haunted by nuns in the parlor, a jolly cavalier in the dining room, and a headless woman in the kitchen. None of these was seen by us, though a jolly cavalier did stray in from the neighboring pub, looking for the washroom. The phone was a payphone outside the house, in a booth also used for storing potatoes, and I would clamber over and through them to deal with the editing of, for instance, the Updike review that appears here. I wrote in a separate space, the fisherman's cottage turned vacation home, where I struggled with the Ega heater as well as the novel I'd started. I got my first case of chilblains doing this, but had to give up on the novel when I found myself snarled up in the time sequence, with no way out. Right after that, we went to West Berlin, where in 1984 I began The Handmaid's Tale. We made some side visits to Poland, East Germany, and Czechoslovakia, which doubtless contributed to the atmosphere of the book. Totalitarian dictatorships, however different the costumes, share the same climate of fear and silence. I finished the book in the spring of 1985, where I was visiting chair at the University of Alabama in Tuscaloosa. It was the last book I wrote on an electric typewriter. I faxed the chapters as they were finished to my typist in Toronto to be retyped properly, and I recall being amazed by the magic of instant transmission. The book came out in Canada in 1985, and in England and the United States in 1986, and was shortlisted for the Booker Prize, among other forms of uproar. I bought a black outfit for the dinner. We spent part of 1987 in Australia, where I was finally able to come to grips with Cat's Eye. The snowiest scenes in the book were written during balmy spring days in Sydney, with kookaburras yelling for hamburger on the back porch. The book was published in 1988 in Canada and the United States, and in England in 1989, where it too was shortlisted for the Booker Prize. I had to buy another black outfit. Shortly afterwards, the fatwa was proclaimed against Salman Rushdie. Who knew that this was the first straw in what was to become not only a wind, but a hurricane? All this time, The Handmaid's Tale had been making its progress through the intestinal workings of the film industry. It finally emerged in finished form, scripted by Harold Pinter and directed by Volker Schlondorf. The film premiered in the two Berlins in 1989, just as the wall had fallen. You could buy pieces of it, with the colored ones being more expensive. I attended the film festivities. There were the same kinds of East German border guards who had been so cold in 1984, but now they were grinning and exchanging cigars with tourists. The East Berlin audience was the more receptive to the film. This was our life, one woman told me quietly. How euphoric we felt for a short time in 1989. How dazed by the spectacle of the impossible made real. How wrong we were about the brave new world we were about to enter. The first section has 13 essays altogether. They include essays about Atwood's writer friends, book reviews, and topics and themes that are important to Atwood. It begins with the essay about Dennis Lee, and it's called Dennis Revisited. Atwood shares how Dennis and her met, how they became friends, and how they have collaborated many times. One of the things that they have done together, which we've probably talked about before, and that is how they started the independent press of House of Anansi, which is where this edition of Moving Targets was published. Atwood includes an essay on Marian Engel, and Engel is known for her novel Bear, in which a woman has a relationship with a bear. And Atwood discusses several of her books while paying tribute to her friend, but she also talks about how Engel influenced her own writing. And this is at the bottom, it starts at the bottom of page 27, and it says this. She'd caught something that was like the tone of those early conversations. It wasn't just an extension. It was a vindication of all that talk. It was the way she wrote. That sort of material wasn't commonly used. Domestic material was either sentimentalized and sugared over, or it was turned back on itself, filled with irony and self-deprecation. She used it as straight literary material, and she made me see that it was possible to use it. If you've been following this series, then you will not be surprised that Susanna Moodie makes another appearance. In fact, she makes several appearances in this book. Atwood reviews Roughing It in the Bush, and Moodie is brought up so much in this series because of the impact that she has had on Atwood's writing, and she has probably been the most surprising factor for me when it comes to Atwood. In this essay, Atwood shares her relationship to Moodie's writing, and she looks at what Roughing It in the Bush has to offer the modern reader. In Atwood's essay on the Jest of God by Margaret Lawrence, we learn that even Atwood gets starstruck. And throughout the essays, there are glimpses of biographical information. In this section, the essay titled Great Aunts is probably the most biographical. Atwood talks about her family in Nova Scotia, particularly about how her aunts influenced her writing life and how they supported her writing, even if that meant they did it quietly, and even if her writing was considered to be scandalous. The books Atwood reviews in this section are The Witches of Eastwick by John Updike, And this review, like many of her reviews, has a lot of humor. And in this one, she makes a statement, she makes many statements about Updike, and including that he is curious what being a woman is like. And as she has done before, she also makes comparisons using other writers that she reads. So from this essay alone, we know that she has been influenced by authors such as Nathaniel Hawthorne, Keats, and Kierkegaard. Atwood reviews a short story collection by Italian writer Italo Calvino called Difficult Loves, and this is an author that I still need to read, and this review may have moved him up my TBR. Toni Morrison's Beloved, which Atwood describes as a hair raiser, and describes it quite favorably. I've only seen the movie Beloved, and it was not encouragement for me to read the book. So reading what Atwood had to say about the writing, and especially about the supernatural elements, that may have persuaded me to pick up the book. Well, we'll see. The review of The Warrior Queens by Antonia Fraser has similar themes to some of Atwood's writing, specifically when it comes to the role of women in society. And other themes such as the Canadian North, environmental issues, and writing all find themselves within these essays. When it comes to writing, we learn Atwood's thoughts on appropriation and on her process for choosing stories for a collection that she was putting together. And she admires short stories and writing from a number of people, including Michael Cunningham, Graham Greene, Dale Ray Phillips, Arthur Robinson, Harriet Dewar, Larry Brown, Douglas Glover, and Mavis Gallant, and Alice Munro, among many others that are mentioned. But I loved the humility that she showed at the end of the essay that was about the short story collection. Atwood thanks the authors for the pleasure their stories gave her. And she says, and for what they added to her own sense of what a story is and what a story can be. The final essay in this first section is about The Handmaid's Tale and how it was written. And we've talked about this book, a number of times now, and how Atwood has never put anything in the novel that hadn't already happened in the world or wasn't happening at the time. This essay goes a bit deeper, with Atwood describing why she considers The Handmaid's Tale to be speculative fiction and a dystopian novel. And then she talks about the reading that she did that influenced her writing of the novel. So Atwood's reading about utopian worlds and dystopian worlds, as well as Second World War literature, all helped to prepare her to create or imagine the world of The Handmaid's. The second section, which is from 1990 to 2000, begins with Atwood's summary of the decade. And I am going to read some of it to you. And if you've been reading along, it will kind of put our reading into context and give Atwood's perspective on the time. So this is starting on page 115. And it says this: Things were quieter on the writing front, mine at least. In 1991, I published Wilderness Tips, a collection of stories written during the late 1980s. In the same year, we went to France in search of writing time. We could not rent one house for the whole period, so we rented 3 successive houses, one for fall, one for winter, one for spring. It was in these 3 houses that I began writing my novel, The Robber Bride. I also put together a selection of very short fiction called Good Bones, a companion to the 1983 Murder in the Dark. It was published in 1992 with a cover design I'd pasted together out of issues of French Vogue magazine. Both books were done for a small press, and author collage saves money. We returned to Canada in time for the summer of 1992. I completed The Robber Bride in January of 1993 on a train going across Canada. My father had died earlier that month, right after I myself had been seriously ill with scarlet fever, and it was an effort of will to finish. A book of poetry, Morning in the Burned House, came out in 1995. Also in that year, I published a series of 4 lectures I'd given at Oxford University on the subject of Canadian literature and the North. The title was Strange Things. I began the novel Alias Grace while I was on a book tour in Europe, in Switzerland, a suitably Freudian Jungian locale. The process is described in the essay In Search of Alias Grace. What I didn't put in it is that right after finishing the book, we went to a small village in Western Ireland, and I had to edit the book by FedEx. I did not yet have email, which meant that I had to hang a tea towel on the hedge so the delivery man would know where we were. I wrote The Blind Assassin after several false starts, one of them in Canada, one of them in a curious rented by internet flat in London. The breakthrough came, again, in France, where I was writing on the assemblage of end tables that served as a desk. I finished it in 1999 and did the editing partly in Madrid, where I was also finishing the 6 lectures I gave at Cambridge University that year on the subject of writers and writing, which were published as Negotiating with the Dead. So during the early months of that year, it was bright blue skies and sunlight and the eating of churros, and then in the spring, it was the wonderful Cambridge gardens and bluebells in the woods and mist. The Blind Assassin came out in the fall. It became the 4th of my books to be shortlisted for the Booker Prize, and I had to put together another black outfit. To my surprise, the book committed what Oscar Wilde would have called an unpardonable solecism of style by actually winning. Many Canadians were pleased by this. Some weren't. To backtrack on New Year's Eve 2000, the millennium was ushered in. Our computers were all supposed to go into meltdown, but they didn't. My mother was by this time very old and nearly blind, but she could still see bright lights. We arranged some fireworks outside her picture window so she could participate, and my sister accidentally set fire to the backyard. That's my image of the grand event, my sister jumping up and down in the dry weeds, attempting to stamp out the conflagration. On my journal page that began the year 2000, I scribbled, "The fireworks were very good on TV, except for the fatuous commentary. Nothing leaked. The church bells rang. It was quite warm. There was a half moon. The angels did not arrive, or at least none visible to the naked eye. No bombs fell, no snow, no terrorists around here." Famous last words. This section contains 14 essays, beginning with Atwood acknowledging that times were changing when it came to writing from Indigenous authors. So Atwood reviews 2 short stories by one of my favorite authors, Thomas King. She very eloquently describes how clever and talented King is when it comes to how he uses humor, and I happen to agree with her on this. Gabriel Garcia Marquez is still an author that I need to read, and Atwood describes Marquez's novels as literary events. She also describes his writing about politics as prophetic. An author and novel that I am very familiar with is Lucy Maud Montgomery's Anne of Green Gables, also one of my favorites. Atwood, like most Canadians, has some connection to this story, not least of which is her own connection to the Maritimes. And she mentions the draw of other cultures to the story of Anne, the obvious elements that make the book a Canadian classic, or really any classic at the time. Having an orphan as the main character was one of them. But she also goes deeper and talks about the adults in the novel and their relationships to the young people. In this section, Atwood introduced me to Canadian poet Gwendolyn McEwen, who I have not only never read, but I don't ever recall hearing of her before. And Atwood first met McEwen at a coffee house when McEwen was probably about 19 years old. And it is clear that Atwood admires her for publishing when she was young and beginning with poetry, which made sense at the time. It was a way of getting in. And she also describes McEwen as having the desire to be out on the sharp edge with the boys and not in the kitchen with the girls. And I thought that all of these characteristics, it's something that Atwood has in common with her. From some of the essays, we learn or are reminded of Atwood's lifelong love of fairy tales and the Brothers Grimm. And this shows in her review of Marina Warner's Not So Grim. Atwood admires how Warner has, as she puts it, become the rescuer of some fairy tales. And as we know from our reading of some of Atwood's work, she herself has turned some fairy tales on their heads with how she has been very clever in her reimaginings of them. So as some of you know, there is a group of booktubers and subscribers who will be reading Hilary Mantel's Thomas Cromwell trilogy. So we'll be reading that together, and I have never read Mantel before, so I was delighted that this section included a review of one of Mantel's novels. I think it's called An Experiment in Love, and I was even more delighted that Atwood calls Mantel an exceptionally good writer. Atwood also suggests that the book could be fatter and include more details, and it seems that maybe Hilary Mantel knew about that and heard her, and that she took her up on it when she was writing Wolf Hall, which comes in around like 600 pages, and then she follows it by 2 more books. So I'm looking forward to seeing how that reading journey goes. I'm looking forward to reading with everyone. There are a number of essays on the topic of writing in this section as well, and they look at the roles of women and how women have been, I'm going to say, permitted to behave in literature. And Atwood again mentions fairy tales as one of her sources for this, which I loved. In one of the essays, Atwood gives 9 attempts to the question, "Why do you write?" And I thought that I would share 2 of her attempts because they were quite brilliant. And the first, or I guess in this case it's her 3rd attempt, is on page 131. Why do you write? I hate writing about my writing because I have nothing to say about it. I have nothing to say about it because I can't remember what goes on when I'm doing it. That time is like small pieces cut out of my brain. It's not time I myself have lived. I can remember the details of the rooms and places where I've written, the circumstances, the other things I did before and after, but not the process itself. Writing about writing requires self-consciousness. Writing itself requires the abdication of it. And I also like what she says in the 6th attempt, which is on page 133. Why do you write? You learn to write by reading and writing, writing and reading. As a craft, it's acquired through the apprentice system, but you choose your own teachers. Sometimes they're alive, sometimes dead. As a vocation, it involves the laying on of hands. You receive your vocation, and in your turn, you must pass it on. Perhaps you will do this only through your work, perhaps in other ways. Either way, you're part of a community, the community of writers, the community of storytellers that stretches back through time to the beginning of human society. And I think that Atwood does that very well, that she has been part of the community of writers and has been giving back to writers in many different ways. One of the essays is about Canadian historical fiction, and Atwood makes a really interesting observation. She says the following on page 196. Fiction is where individual memory and experience and collective memory and experience come together in greater or lesser proportions. The closer the fiction is to us, the more we recognize and claim it as an individual rather than collective. Margaret LAURENCE used to say that her English readers thought The Stone Angel was about old age. The Americans thought it was about some old woman they knew, and the Canadians thought it was about their grandmothers. Each character in fiction has an individual life, replete with personal detail. The eating of meals, the flossing of teeth, the making of love, the birthing of children, the attending of funerals, and so forth, but each also exists within a context, a fictional world comprised of geology, weather, economic forces, social classes, cultural references, and wars and plagues and such big public events. So Atwood explains that the writer is always trapped in a place and time, despite the time period that they are actually writing about. And she shares some of her personal story to further her point, and she does it to perfection. So I want to read that to you as well. And this begins on page 197. What I've said about fictional characters is, of course, also true of every real human being. For example, here I am giving this lecture in Ottawa. By what twists of coincidence or fate, how novelistic these terms sound, but also how faithful to real experience they are. Do I find myself back here in my city of origin? For it was in Ottawa that I was born, 57 years, 3 days, and several hours ago. The place was the Ottawa General Hospital. The date, November 18th, 1939. About the exact hour, my mother, to the despair of many astrologers since, is a little vague, that being a period when women were routinely conked out with ether. I do know that I was born after the end of the Grey Cup football game. The doctors thanked my mother for waiting. They'd all been following the game on the radio. In those days, most doctors were men, which may explain their sportive attitude. In those days. There I am. You see, being born in those days, which are not the same as these days. No ether now and many a woman doctor. As for Ottawa, I wouldn't have been there at all if it hadn't been for the Great Depression. My parents were economic refugees from Nova Scotia. There's your economic force. From which they were then cut off by the Second World War. There's your big public event. We lived, here's your personal detail, in a long, dark, railroad car-shaped second-story apartment on Patterson Avenue near the Rideau Canal. There's your geology, more or less. An apartment in which my mother once caused a flood by rinsing the diapers in the toilet where they got stuck. In those days, there were no disposable diapers, and not even any diaper service. In those days, as I'm sure some of you believe you remember, there was much more snow. There's your weather. And it was much whiter and more beautiful than any snow they ever come up with nowadays. As a child, I helped to build snow forts that were much bigger than the Parliament buildings and even more labyrinthine. There's your cultural reference. I remember this very clearly, so it must be true, and there's your individual memory. Atwood then describes her attempt at writing Canadian historical fiction, and of course we have already read this novel together, Alias Grace. So Atwood says that she didn't plan to write it, but somehow ended up doing it anyway. And not surprisingly, Atwood's link to Grace Marks is Susanna Moodie, who Susanna described meeting Grace in 1851 in the Kingston Penitentiary in her book Life in the Clearings. So in the 1970s, Atwood was then asked to write a script for television about Grace Marks, and Atwood used Moodie's version of events. And then Atwood was asked to turn the television script into a theater piece. And then in the early 90s, while on a book tour in Zurich, scenes for the book came to Atwood. And while writing and researching for the novel, Atwood realized that Susanna Moodie's memory was faulty, and she had wrong names and wrong locations. And as we already know about the story, there were so many divisions about every possible thing imaginable. And even Grace told her story with changing details. So what I love most is how Atwood approached the writing of her book, and she explains this on page 214. I felt that, to be fair, I had to represent all points of view. I devised the following set of guidelines for myself. When there was a solid fact, I could not alter it. Long as I might to have Grace witness McDermott's execution, it could not be done, because, worse luck, she was already in the penitentiary on that day. Also, every major element in the book had to be suggested by something in the writing about Grace and her times. However dubious such writing might be, but in the gaps left unfilled, I was free to invent. Since there were a lot of gaps, there is a lot of invention. Alias Grace is very much a novel rather than a documentary. Alias Grace is one of my favorite Atwood novels that we've read so far. Susanna Moodie's version of events and Atwood's version differ significantly, and I have to admit that I like Atwood's version a lot better. So in several of these essays, there are tidbits of biographical information. The one in this section that is all biographical and is definitely worth the read gives you a glimpse of Atwood in 1964 when she decided to spend 3 months traveling. She goes to London and France to become more cultured. This section ends with Atwood talking about Al Purdy's poetry, who is another writer that I have yet to read. The third and final section goes from 2001 to 2004, and one might think that because it is a shorter time period, it would be the shortest section in the book, but those people would be wrong. So there are 24 essays in this section, and Atwood calls it a fistful of editors, because many of the essays are a tribute to the editors that she has worked with over the years. which in and of itself is so Atwood. But in order to keep this video from getting way too long, I am only going to talk about a few of the essays. Atwood mentions several of them in her introduction to this section, and they are once again about Atwood's friends and influences. And I will begin, as I did with the other sections, by reading just a little snippet of the introduction so that you know what was going on in Margaret's life at the time. So this begins on page 229. In the first part of 2001, I was still on book tour for The Blind Assassin. I'd got as far as New Zealand and Australia and was taking a break in Queensland to do some bird watching with friends when I unaccountably found myself beginning another novel. I continued with this novel back in Canada. I wrote part of it on an island in Lake Erie where my novel writing was sadly interrupted by the untimely death of Mordecai Rickler. Several other friends and fellow writers also died during this period, and I wrote about some of them. I wrote some of Oryx and Crake on a boat to the Arctic. On September 11th, 2001, I was in the Toronto airport waiting for a plane to New York for the paperback launch of The Blind Assassin when the catastrophe took place. One of the pieces in this section is connected with that event. At that period, I was working on an introduction to H. Rider Haggard's peculiar novel, She. The editor on this quixotic project was a young man called Benjamin Dreyer. And it was from him that I was able to learn via email during that time of blocked phone lines that my friends and colleagues in New York were safe. Atwood begins this section with a heartwarming piece about Mordecai Rickler shortly after his death. And as a Canadian, I have heard so much about Mordecai Rickler. I even own several of his books, and I have never read them, so at least not yet. Atwood describes Mordecai as her generation's trailblazer, a shy, generous, and honest man with high standards. And you can just tell from Atwood's words that she had great affection for her friend. And the essay was also a reminder to me that I have gaping holes in my reading of Canadian literature. Next week, the Giller Prize shortlist will be revealed, and this is a prize that I love to follow, and I will be posting my video later this week with my shortlist hopefuls. And I mention this because Mordecai is one of the key players in creating the Giller Prize, and also served as a juror the first year. Timothy Finley is another friend and writer that passed away that Atwood pays tribute to. And it seems that he was affectionately called Tiff. And in the tribute, Atwood talks about Finley's love of animals and how he probably related to them in many different ways, especially Peter Rabbit. And the idea being that animals like Finley have been so misunderstood. And Finley is also another glaringly obvious gap in my Canadian literature reading. And they say things come in threes. So the other author that I really need to read, and I thought I had, is Carol Shields. And a piece that Atwood wrote a week after Shields' death is included in this section. And I actually just purchased a Carol Shields novel, and I believe I have 3 or 4 of them. I really did think I had read them, but when I looked, no, I had not. So it's another reminder of how many incredibly talented Canadian writers that I have yet to read. One of the essays that is not only biographical but also relevant to the time period is called When Afghanistan Was at Peace. And this tells the story of Margaret, Graham, and their daughter's visit to Afghanistan in 1978 when it was still relatively peaceful. And weeks after their trip, war broke out. And then 6 years after that, Atwood wrote The Handmaid's Tale, and she says in the essay that that trip influenced that novel. And another essay on, or I guess in this case it's a letter that I think is relevant because of our time, is called Letter to America. And this was written probably about 20 years ago, shortly after 9/11, it seems from some of the references. And there are 2 things that I want to mention about this letter. One is that Atwood's approach to this letter is not just that of a neighbor to the north, but like a really good friend, and the kind of friend who you're such good friends that they can call you out on your stuff, and you will either listen or at the very least respect them for saying something to you when no one else would. And then the second thing, and this probably won't be surprising for those of you who have been following along and learning about Atwood on this journey with me, but she was prolific even then. So 20-ish years ago, she said this in her letter to America that many people, I think, would say came true. And this is, so after Atwood talks about, what has been so good about the relationship between Canada and the US, and then she calls America out on some of their stuff. And then she says this on page 327. If you proceed much further down the slippery slope, people around the world will stop admiring the good things about you. They'll decide that your city upon the hill is a slum, and your democracy is a sham, and therefore you have no business trying to impose your sullied vision on them. They'll think you've abandoned the rule of law. They'll think you fouled your own nest. So I wonder if Atwood were to write a letter now, what she would say and what she might predict, even if unknowingly, for the future. The last book we read in the Mondays with Margaret series was Oryx and Crake. So I want to talk a little bit about the essay that is included in this section, appropriately called Writing Oryx and Crake. So in March of 2001, while in Australia, Atwood began Oryx and Crake, and she describes it really well on page 328. For the most part, we were bird watching, but we also visited several open-sided cave complexes where Aboriginal people had lived continuously in harmony with their environment for tens of thousands of years. After that, we went to Cassowary House near Cairns, operated by Philip Gregory, an extraordinary birder, and it was while looking over Philip's balcony at the red-necked crakes scuttling about in the underbrush that Oryx and Crake appeared to me almost in its entirety. I began making notes on it that night. I hadn't planned to begin another novel so soon after the previous one. I'd thought I might take some time off, write a few short pieces, clean out the cellar. But when a story appears to you with such insistence, you can't postpone it. She continues on page 329. I continued to write away at Oryx and Crake during the summer of 2001. We had some other travels planned, and I wrote several chapters of this book on a boat in the Arctic, where I could see for myself how quickly the glaciers were receding. I had the whole book mapped out and had reached the end of part 7 when I was due to go to New York for the paperback publication of The Blind Assassin. I was sitting in the Toronto airport daydreaming about part 8. In 10 minutes my flight would be called. An old friend of mine came over and said, "We're not flying." "What do you mean?" I said. "Come and look at the television," he replied. It was September 11th. I stopped writing for a number of weeks. It's deeply unsettling when you're writing about a fictional catastrophe, and then a real one happens. I thought maybe I should turn to gardening books, something more cheerful. But then I started writing again, because what use would gardening books be in a world without gardens, and without books? And that was the vision that was preoccupying me. Like The Handmaid's Tale, Oryx and Crake has nothing in it that hasn't already been invented, or has started to be invented, and we will be looking more into that series very soon. Atwood includes an essay on George Orwell in this section, which I think also needs to be mentioned, because these two dystopians, The Handmaid's Tale and Oryx and Crake, probably would not have happened if it wasn't for Orwell. They were influenced by Atwood's reading of Animal Farm in 1984, among other things. From our reading, I think that Orwell probably influenced Atwood in other ways as well. I think we see it as early as the animals in that country, and maybe even in other things. Finally, the last two essays in the third section are autobiographical. To Beachy Island is about Atwood as a pilgrim, and she describes her own pilgrimage, as well as the pilgrims that she has encountered in literature. And then the final essay, again, is so Atwoodian. Her humor shines through, and she is such a good sport. The essay is called Mortification, and in it, Atwood shares 3 times that she has been publicly mortified, and it's just an interesting way to finish off the book. There are three things that I enjoyed most about this book. One is learning more about Atwood and how we're able to do that, and it comes out in her writing about others. Second is the opportunity that this book and the others like it have given me to learn about authors that I haven't read yet. Some of them I haven't heard of yet. And third is the respect that Atwood gives other writers, and in this book especially editors as well, while keeping her humor and willingness to poke fun at herself. So I know that this video is a bit long, but it is a side effect of all of the greatness in this book. Moving Targets, along with Survival and Second Words, I think are gems to Canadian literature, and I can't think of another author who has done the kind of work that's necessary to produce these collections. So I'm grateful to Atwood for that. So please let me know in the comments below if you have had a chance to read this book or any of the books and authors that Atwood mentions. It would be great to know your thoughts. And it's good to be back doing the Mondays with Margaret. Thank you so much again for your patience. I'm happy to be back doing this series. Next week there will be 2 videos, both of them shorter than this one, and as we try to get caught up and back on track. So the updated schedule is in the description box below, so be sure to check that out, especially if you're reading along. Thanks again for watching. I look forward to chatting with you in the comments. I hope you enjoy the rest of your day, and don't forget to make every day an adventure.